Lina sat in the lawyer's office with her cane resting against her chair, feeling the presence of her in-laws before they even spoke. They settled into their seats with the heavy, confident posture of people who already knew they had won everything. David walked away with the house, while Claire took the entire investment portfolio, and their mother claimed every piece of the family jewelry. Then the lawyer finally said Lina's name, and the room went quiet for a split second. He announced she had been left a lighthouse. It was a decommissioned, crumbling structure sitting on a jagged piece of coastline that nobody in their right mind wanted. The laughter started before the lawyer could even finish his sentence, a dry and practiced sound that filled the room like thick smoke. David leaned back and joked that she wouldn't even know which way was up in a place like that. Lina didn't say a word, but inside her, something began to shift as a single question took root. She wondered why Thomas would leave her something so specific and seemingly useless unless he knew something his family didn't. They were convinced they had left her with nothing, but they had no idea what was actually waiting for her inside that stone shaft. Thomas and Lina had built a quiet, steady life together in a modest home without any need for fanfare or children. They simply fit together perfectly, and he never once treated her blindness like a problem that needed to be solved or managed. To him, she was just his partner, but his family never could see her that way. At every family dinner, they tossed out uncomfortable jokes that hung in the air like a bad smell. They spoke to her slowly, as if losing her vision had somehow damaged her hearing or her mind as well. His mother would often ask Thomas how he managed to live with her, speaking as if Lina weren't sitting right there at the table. David would laugh about her limitations while Claire just looked away, trapped in an awkward silence she never bothered to explain. Lina felt that cold distance every single time she walked into a room and heard the conversations suddenly stop. When his mother did speak to her directly, her voice would change pitch and slow down, which is exactly how people talk to a small child. Thomas did his best to protect her by steering the conversations or laughing along to keep the peace, though the joy never actually reached his voice. Lina always knew what was happening because you can feel that kind of rejection even when people think you can't see it. They assumed their faces told the whole story, but they didn't realize she could hear every shift in their posture and every bit of false brightness in their tone. Years passed by with Thomas at work and Lina navigating the world with her cane, building a life that didn't rely on his family's approval. The weight of their judgment was always there between them. Never quite heavy enough to break their bond, but it never truly went away. Then Thomas died quite suddenly from a stroke at 3 a.m, leaving her with no warning and no chance to say goodbye. The funeral was a small, lonely affair where his mother didn't call for 2 weeks and David didn't bother to help with any of the arrangements. Claire sent a bouquet of flowers, but there was no note attached, just the cold gift of petals and stems. Lina sat alone in the house they had shared, and the silence felt like a final confirmation of the truth she had always suspected. She had never really been part of that family. She was just someone Thomas had chosen, and his choice didn't matter to them once he was gone. She waited for them to reach out or offer some kind of help, but the phone stayed silent and the door stayed shut. 3 weeks after the funeral, the lawyer finally called to schedule the reading of the will, and Lina went in expecting nothing because she had finally learned her lesson. The lawyer's office had that heavy smell of old paper and expensive leather that usually means bad news for someone. Lina's cane rested against her chair while she sat with her hands folded, just waiting. Even without her sight, she could feel the shape of the room and the weight of the massive mahogany desk in front of her. Beside her, she heard the 3 of them shift their weight and pull their chairs closer together. It was a subtle move, but they always did that when they wanted to stand as a unit against her. The lawyer didn't waste any time and started with David. The family residence in the city, which is valued at about $2.3 million, goes to David Michael Bennett. David didn't just smile, she could actually hear the smugness in his voice when he leaned forward to thank the lawyer. $2.3 million was a staggering amount, and that house was the one his grandfather had built with his own hands. It was the crown jewel of the family, the property everyone knew was worth a fortune. Then it was Claire's turn. The investment portfolio, including all securities and accounts, is valued at approximately $1.8 million and goes to Claire Margaret Bennett Hayes. Additionally, she receives the summer cottage on Lake Michigan, which is valued at about $500,000. Claire let out a small, satisfied sound before murmuring her thanks for over $2 million in property and liquid cash. This was money that would compound and grow, the kind of wealth that builds a permanent safety net. Their mother was next, and she walked away with the jewelry, the antiques, and the silver. These were the things that truly mattered to them, because they proved you belonged to a legacy that lasted.
Lina sat perfectly still in the heavy silence that stretched between one name and the next. She knew exactly how this worked, because she had spent years watching inheritance sort people into two very different categories. There were the people who mattered, and then there was everyone else. The lawyer cleared his throat, and the paper in his hand rustled. And to my wife, Lina Marie Bennett, I leave the Lighthouse property on the northern coast, including the keeper's cottage and every structure on that land. That was the end of it. There was no cash, no long explanation, and no instructions on what to do with a broken-down lighthouse sitting on rocks where nobody wanted to live. It was just a tower of stone in the middle of nowhere. David leaned back in his leather chair and let out a real laugh, the kind of loud, mocking sound that made the room feel smaller.
A lighthouse, he said, shaking his head while the irony sank in. That is absolutely perfect, because she won't even know which way is up out there.
Claire and their mother both smiled, and even the lawyer looked a bit uncomfortable as he shuffled his papers. He suddenly seemed very interested in the documents on his desk, avoiding everyone's eyes. Lina didn't say a word, which was her usual response when they laughed at her expense. Silence was always safer than words in that family, mostly because silence couldn't be twisted and used against you later on. But as she sat there, something started shifting deep inside her. It wasn't anger, at least not yet, but rather a question that began forming like a shape moving in the darkness. Why would Thomas leave her something so incredibly specific? It was useless to everyone else in the room, but he had chosen a lighthouse instead of money or a normal house.
He gave her a structure with a shaft running through it like a spine, sitting on a coast where the world felt like it ended. Maybe he knew something that the rest of the family didn't. Perhaps he trusted her to find something they were too blinded by greed to ever see. The lawyer was droning on now about property taxes, deed information, and how to contact the local caretaker. Lina heard the words, but she wasn't really listening anymore. Her mind was already traveling north toward that rocky coast and the dark tower waiting for her in the mist. 2 days after that cold reading of the will, Lina was sorting through the deed envelope when she found a letter hidden inside. She recognized Thomas's handwriting immediately, but it wasn't the careful, controlled script he used for business. This writing was loose and hurried, looking very much like he had written it in the dark or in a great rush. The envelope was sealed shut with tape, and her name was written on the front.
Just her name, nothing else.
She opened it slowly, her fingers carefully working the paper as she felt the unexpected weight of what was inside. The letter itself was short, and she had to read it 3 times before the meaning really started to sink in. Lina, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and I need you to know something my family will never understand. The lighthouse is not what they think it is, so I need you to look for the gear and turn it. Everything changes once you do. I love you, and I have always truly seen you. Thomas. That was the whole message, with no other explanation or instructions to guide her. However, there was something taped to the back of the envelope that felt old and cold. It was a heavy metal key. Lina sat at the kitchen table in the house they had shared for years and held that letter and the key tight. Something inside her chest finally clicked into place, feeling exactly like a lock turning over.
Thomas had known his time was short. Or at least he sensed the end was coming, because he wrote this letter 6 months before his stroke. He had hidden these specific instructions where only she would ever think to look. He didn't leave them for his children or his first wife. He left them for her. He trusted her to understand a secret that his family was too shallow to ever grasp.
The next morning, she called the lawyer to get the exact directions to the lighthouse. They gave her the address and the details for the caretaker, so she hired a car service to handle the long drive north. The journey took 6 full hours, and Lina spent the whole time in the back seat listening to the world change outside. The city sounds began to fade away as the traffic thinned out, and the sound of the wind became a constant, roaring presence. Even the smell changed, shifting from exhaust and concrete to the clean, sharp scent of salt air and the open ocean. When they finally arrived, the driver helped her out of the car and described the scene for her. He saw a grey stone tower rising 90 feet into the air, with dark windows and a weathered keeper's cottage standing right beside it. Below them, the waves hit the rocks with a sound like a steady, rhythmic drum. She could smell the salt now, and it felt thick and old, like it had been layered into the very earth for centuries. The wind was much stronger here, whistling through the spaces in the tower and making the whole structure hum at a frequency she could feel in her bones. The cottage and the lighthouse were hers now, and she could do whatever she pleased with them. She paid the driver and asked him to return in 2 weeks because she had a lot of work to do and needed to be alone to do it. Inside the cottage, the air felt heavy with dust and the metallic scent of rust and salt spray.
Her cane tapped a steady rhythm against the wooden floor as she explored the small kitchen, the bedroom, and a sitting room that faced the water. Eventually, she made her way into the lighthouse itself. The spiral stairs were made of iron, and every single step rang out loudly under the strike of her cane. She climbed higher and higher through the different levels until she reached the lamp room at the very top. The windows were empty and open to the wind, letting the cold air swirl around her. But it was the central shaft that really drew her in. It was the hollow heart of the lighthouse, running from the top all the way to the bottom like a stone spine. It was dark and empty, but to Lina, it felt full of hidden possibilities. She began to descend slowly, counting every level as she passed it and feeling her way along the rough stone walls. Somewhere inside this massive shaft, Thomas had hidden something that was worth keeping secret from the world.
And she was going to be the one to find it. For 2 long weeks, Lina lived inside the rhythm of the lighthouse. Every morning, she made the climb up those spiral stairs, her fingers trailing along the stone walls that felt smooth and soft from a century of salt and wind. She started to recognize the way the sun moved through the tower because she could feel the warmth hitting her skin through the glass at different hours. She learned exactly which steps would creak under her weight and how the wind changed its tune from a whistle to a roar depending on the time of day. The entire building was becoming a language she finally knew how to read. But her mind always drifted back to the shaft. It was the hollow center of the tower, running straight down through the structure like a spine, wider at the bottom and narrowing as it reached for the sky. It felt empty and expectant, like it was waiting for her to do something. Thomas had been very clear in his instructions to find the gear and turn it, promising that once she did, everything would change forever. She began her search at the very bottom by running her hands along the base of the shaft to feel for anything that didn't belong. There was nothing but cold stone and more stone, though the smell of old rust was getting thicker with every inch she covered. That was when her fingers finally hit something massive. It was a giant iron gear bolted deep into the rock, and it was so large that she couldn't even wrap both arms around its diameter. Each individual tooth felt as big as her fist, worn down by decades of hard work before sitting silent for just as long. Most people would have walked away seeing nothing but a piece of junk or a decaying relic, but Lina could feel the intention behind it. The metal wasn't perfectly smooth because there were deliberate notches and patterns cut into the edge that didn't match the rest of the machine. She traced those marks over and over again, letting her fingertips memorize the sequence like she was reading a message written in Braille. It was a secret note in metal, and she realized right then that Thomas knew she would be the only one who could truly see it. The keyhole was tucked away in the center, nearly invisible to the eye because it was designed to look like a simple patch of rust. It was just a tiny depression in the heavy metal, a hidden place meant for a very specific key. She pulled out the old brass lamp key that Thomas had taped to his final letter, feeling its weight and the way the metal had thinned from years of use. It slid into the slot perfectly, fitting like it had been made for that exact moment. When she finally turned it, the silence of the lighthouse shattered.
First came a deep, grinding groan of metal sliding against metal after decades of standing still, a sound that echoed up the hollow center of the tower until it felt like the whole world was vibrating. Lina's heart started pounding against her ribs because she had no idea what she was about to uncover. She just knew that Thomas had planned this with incredible care, arranging a letter and a key in a lonely lighthouse on a coast where nobody else wanted to be. The grinding noise shifted into a sharp, definitive click that signaled something had finally unlocked. A narrow passage opened up, barely wide enough for her to squeeze through with her cane, and she felt the air pressure shift as the stone wall beside the gear gave way. Beyond that gap lay a set of stone steps spiraling down into a thick darkness that meant nothing to a woman who lived in shadows anyway. Lina moved forward with caution, tapping her cane against each step and counting them as she descended into the earth. 20 steps, then 30, then 40, and with every foot she dropped, the air became cooler and much heavier. The sharp scent of salt and rust faded away, replaced by the smell of something ancient that had been sealed off from the world for a very long time. It felt like she was walking straight into the heart of a secret that had been waiting for her to arrive. As the passage twisted, the stones beneath her hands felt newer and more precise, as if someone had built this hidden place to last for centuries. This wasn't an accident or a ruin, but a deliberate vault designed with a purpose. Thomas had known she would find her way here, and he had made sure the path was ready for her. The narrow passage eventually opened up into a chamber built right into the base of the lighthouse shaft. As Lina stepped inside, the tapping of her cane changed from a dull thud to a sharp ring that told her the space around her had expanded. She could feel the stillness of the air, which felt preserved and heavy, like a room that hadn't breathed in 50 years. She didn't say a word, moving forward slowly, until her hands brushed against cold metal shelves bolted directly into the stone walls. On those shelves sat objects with real weight and history. Her fingers moved over stacks of old paper that had been kept in protective sleeves to keep the dampness away, and she could tell they were organized with obsessive detail. She carefully pulled one out and traced the raised ink of an official seal at the top, realizing it was a deed for a piece of property. She reached for another, then another, finding more deeds for different locations and different plots of land. Her hands began to move faster as the truth started to sink in through her fingertips. These weren't just old scraps of paper, but a complete record of a fortune, including bank statements, certificates, and letters written in a steady hand from decades ago. This was the hidden history of Thomas's grandfather, a story that had been buried and preserved, just waiting for the right person to come looking. Lina sat down on the freezing stone floor and began to read the only way she knew how. She had learned to recognize the feel of embossed letters long ago, and she could sense the importance of these documents just by their substance and the way they had been tucked away. There was a deed from 1953 for 40 acres of prime farmland, followed by another from 1961 for 300 acres of protected forest. Then she found the big one, a stretch of waterfront property from 1987 that would be worth tens of millions of dollars in today's market. The letters tucked between the deeds explained why all of this had been kept in the dark for so long. There had been ugly family disputes and a secret marriage that the grandfather's relatives never would have accepted. To avoid a lifetime of inheritance battles, the old man had chosen to bury his wealth so deep that the vultures in the family would never be able to find it. He picked the lighthouse because it was the one property they all despised, the one place they considered a worthless pile of rocks. Sitting there in the silence of the vault, Lina finally understood the depth of what Thomas had done for her. He knew his family would turn on her the second he was gone, because he had watched them treat her with coldness for years. He had seen the masks they wore, and in the months before his stroke, he decided they didn't deserve a single penny of this secret legacy. He left it all to her, but he made sure she had to be brave enough to go out and claim it. The dates on these papers proved everything. showing that the vault had been sealed decades before Lina and Thomas had even met. There was no way the family could claim she had manipulated him or tricked him into changing his will because the evidence was older than she was. This land was worth more than the city house and the entire investment portfolio combined, making the inheritance the rest of the family fought over look like pocket change. But the money wasn't why the tears started to fall. Lina cried because she realized that Thomas had trusted her with a mystery that his sighted family was too blind to ever solve. He knew the world looked at her and saw someone who was less capable or a burden, but he saw her as the only person worthy of his greatest secret. He had left her something that required her specific way of moving through the world, something her hands could understand in a way eyes never could. He didn't see a woman with a limitation, but a woman with a gift for seeing the truth in the dark. Lina ran her fingers over the deeds one last time, feeling the reality of her new security settling into her bones. She sat in that hidden room beneath the earth and knew for certain that Thomas had loved her with a ferocity his family could never even imagine. Lina's lawyer called her just 3 days after she had the documents authenticated, but the family had already made their move. They were contesting the will, and David had filed papers claiming Thomas was mentally unstable when he wrote that final letter. The vultures were circling, arguing that Thomas wasn't of sound mind and that someone, they didn't use her name, but the finger was pointed straight at her, had manipulated him into hiding the family assets. The accusations were sharp and ugly. They claimed Lina knew about the hidden deeds all along, and that she'd convinced Thomas to seal them away as part of a long game for her own financial gain. It was a clean narrative for people who only saw dollar signs, because a widow with nothing suddenly becoming a widow with everything looked suspicious to them. They couldn't wrap their heads around how someone so disconnected from the family business could suddenly inherit a fortune that had been buried for 50 years. But the lawyers tore that story apart in less than 2 weeks. The deeds were dated decades before Lina even met Thomas, and the safe itself had been sealed for half a century. When the experts looked at the handwriting on the letters, they confirmed it was Thomas's work from when he was in his 30s, which was long before Lina ever entered the picture. There was no way she could have known about the vault, let alone manipulated a man she hadn't even met yet, and the evidence made the family's claims look desperate and cruel. The final letter from the legal team was clear. The land belonged to Lina. The deeds were legitimate, and the inheritance was legal and binding. Any further attempts to sue would be thrown out as frivolous, and just like that, the battle was over. The news spread through the family like a slow-acting poison, and soon David was getting awkward calls from colleagues while Claire's friends started avoiding her at the country club. Even their mother stopped mentioning the inheritance entirely, as if the shame of losing was worse than the greed that started it. Then, 3 weeks after the legal dust had settled, David finally called. Lina was sitting in the keeper's cottage, listening to the rhythm of the waves when the phone rang, and when she answered, his voice sounded different. The arrogance had been scraped away, leaving something raw and small underneath that she'd never heard before. "How did you know?" David asked, his voice cracking.
Lina thought about the notches in the gear and the specific pattern her fingers had felt in the dark. She thought about how sighted eyes would have missed it completely because they would have looked at the rust and the corrosion and seen nothing but a piece of junk. Her blindness had become her greatest advantage, allowing her to read a secret in the darkness that the rest of them couldn't see in the middle of the day. But she didn't give him the satisfaction of an explanation. "Thomas showed me where to look," she said firmly. The line went quiet, and she could hear him breathing on the other end as he realized the conversation was over. There was nothing left for him to say that could change the outcome, and a moment later, he hung up. Lina never heard from any of them again, not David, not Claire, and not their mother. They had tried to leave her with nothing and laughed at the lighthouse because they were certain it was worthless. But in the end, she was the one who walked away with everything. The first thing Lina did was refuse every single offer to buy the land. The developers were the first to arrive, sending endless emails from companies that wanted to turn the pristine coastline into resorts, condos, and golf courses. They offered her numbers that should have seemed impossible, talking about tens of millions and then hundreds of millions, but she turned them all down without a second thought. She wasn't interested in the money. She wanted to understand what Thomas's grandfather had worked so hard to preserve.
She kept every acre of the farmland, the forest, and the waterfront. But her main focus was the lighthouse itself. That first summer, she hired a crew of contractors to restore the tower, not as a dusty museum piece, but as a working beacon that could actually guide people home.
The old lamp mechanism was gone, but the stone structure had weathered 100 years of salt and wind and still stood strong. To get it right, she brought in historians and local workers who knew the coast, and she spent months learning the technical details of how lighthouses operate. She listened to audio recordings and talked for hours with engineers who had worked on similar projects until she understood the soul of the building. The keeper's cottage was transformed into a small museum dedicated to the people who lived in isolation to keep others safe, honoring the men and women who stayed awake through storms and fog to keep the light burning. Lina wrote every plaque herself, making sure they were printed in both braille and large text so everyone could experience the stories. She wrote about keepers who spent decades in solitude and those who kept journals while watching ships navigate safely past the rocks that had destroyed so many others. By the time fall arrived, the lighthouse was fully restored and the light was reactivated, turning through the night for the first time in 50 years. Once the building was finished, she turned her attention to the future by establishing a scholarship fund at the university where Thomas had worked. It was a full-ride program for students with disabilities who wanted to pursue science and engineering, and she named it the Thomas Bennett Fund for Adaptive Innovation. It started with just one student, but as the story of the blind widow and her lighthouse spread, the fund began to grow with help from donors and former recipients who wanted to give back. The lighthouse eventually became a destination that people traveled from all over to see. Families would drive up the rocky coast to look at the tower, and local news crews often showed up to interview Lina about the hidden safe and the vault. Sometimes she would give the tours herself, her cane tapping against the stone as she moved through the lamp room and described the gear mechanism. She would tell them about the shaft and the secret passage hidden 50 feet below the foundation, and they always asked her the same thing. "How did you know what to do?" they would ask. "He trusted me to find my way," she always replied. That's all trust really is. It isn't telling someone what to do, but showing them where to look and believing they can see what you already know is there. Lina spent most of her evenings in the cottage now, listening to the waves hit the rocks below with a sound that was constant and reliable. She wasn't happy in the way people usually imagine triumph, because there was no real joy in the family's disappearance, only a different kind of loneliness. But beneath that was a quiet peace, because she knew that Thomas had truly seen her for who she was. He didn't see a burden or a limitation, but a woman who was worthy of an impossible trust, and she had proven him right. That old lighthouse still stands tall against the waves, and its beam cuts through the dark every single night to keep ships away from the jagged rocks. We often think of an inheritance as something handed to us on a silver platter, but the truth is that the greatest gifts are the ones we are trusted to find for ourselves. Stay with me and subscribe if you want to see more stories where family betrayal meets a hidden justice that no one saw coming. The truth is always out there, waiting for a witness, and all it takes is one person brave enough to look beneath the surface.